So when we say community health, beyond the technical terms, social terms of health, what we really mean are culture, context, color, and composition, right? And the reason why we say that is because health is made up of many things. So we've just heard about the neighborhood, right? The place being a context for health. And we know that when we talk about health, and we're going to talk about health broadly here, there's this notion that health is really within the doctor's office. And for us, and on this panel, one of the things we hope that you take away is that health is all the things that make up our life. It is, who we are and what we are and how we live and where we live gets into us, right? So if you don't remember anything else, remember that, right? Health is everything about us. So we know that, particularly from the first panel, but also from the research, that social conditions really kind of make up that statement. That, there are 5 factors. There's medical care and the institutions, there's genetics, there's your behavior, there's the context, but then there's another factor, which is the social status and your economic status. And that's what we're going to focus on specifically here today. It's the jobs we do, the money we make, the education we have, makes up our health as well. And we know that health is tied directly to our wealth and our resources, right? The single strongest predictor in the research of your health status will be your income, your education, your occupation. And that we know that folks who are higher up on the rung of that live longer and have better health outcomes than those who don't, right? So let me just give an example. In the public health research, there's, everyone talks about smoking, right? Smoking cessation, smoking is bad, smoking is anathema, right? But even among those who smoke, that poor smokers have a greater risk of dying earlier than wealthier smokers, just as an example, right? Similarly situated folks doing the same activity, we just know that their status, their socioeconomic status and what they have as resources impact how long you will live, even engaging in the same activity. The other thing I want to put on that is that we heard that place matters to health. And Mary Lee talked about her report, Place and Race Matter. I want to say that as much as place matters to health, race matters to health. And the reason why I say that is when we talk about social status and economic status, we know there is a direct correlation between race and ethnicity and the outcomes that you have in terms of your education status, your income status, your occupational status. And that directly impacts your health. And it impacts your health in a number of ways, and we'll have a panel on this, so I won't delve too deeply into it, but one is this notion of adversity and stress, this notion of safety, this notion of proximity are all part of that equation. So we heard this conversation earlier about the type of resources you have in your neighborhood, what's available to you, what gets placed there, and the agency you have, the ability you have to affect that. That is all dictated by all those factors at once. The other thing I want to emphasize, and this really matters for this panel, because there is this separation in the health conversation between health policy and social policy. And the way in which we think about social policy and the way in which we think about health. And I just want to disabuse us of the notion that social policy isn't health policy. Social policy is health policy. So the example would be the greatest health gains that we made over the 20th century. We had a 30-year increase in life expectancy over the 20th century, weren't due to increases in technology and medical care or advances in care models. They were due to the social policies that passed over the course of the 20th century. Things like sanitation, things like wage and income security, things like housing improvements, and social and civil rights improvements like civil rights laws and voting rights laws. That we saw an increase in life expectancy and decreases in health gaps based on social policy. So we have to understand that when we have these conversations about health, that they are inextricably linked to these broader conversations we have about the community and the population, and these conversations that we actually have about the things that actually impact our lives. And the reason that is important is, and you'll hear this from the panel, is that there are multiple things that impact our lives that could either be detrimental to our health status, or it could be not only supportive, right, but actually create opportunity for better health status. And the reason why I point that out is because I want folks to understand that health inequities aren't natural occurrences. This isn't something that just kind of happens because of who you are genetically, or just because you kind of are born into the world and this is kind of your lot in life. And we know this borne out by the International Health Information. So if you look in Sweden, that there are transfers due to social policy that have an equitable impact on children to reduce the social gradient and the economic kind of vagaries of the market, right? So what it's trying to do is make sure kids aren't exposed to poverty in really harsh ways. So what you have is, after those social transfers, you have a reduction in poverty for children, and they have a higher life expectancy than most of the industrialized world. In the United States, similarly situated, similar income situation where we don't have that type of social policy, you see greater numbers of kids in poverty, and you see greater numbers of kids experience really bad health outcomes, right? That is a social question, right? That is not kind of a natural kind of selection type of issue. And that's important to know in terms of context for this panel, because we have folks who are intervening both in agencies, but also in strategies that are intervening in folks' lives that have the ability to impact that question. And the last thing I want to say is that we all pay a price for not recognizing these connections and allowing these connections to drive, or not making these connections to drive this notion of poor health. That even though we spend in our healthcare system about 16% of our GDP, so $2.2 trillion we spend on healthcare, 3% of that is spent on what we call this community health, public health question. We're still 29th in the world in health status and outcome. And that's not just for African Americans or Latinos or Asian Pacific Islander population, but it's also for whites, right? All of us suffer worse health outcomes because of this question. It is just that the depth of how bad we suffer that question, right, depends on your status in that. But we're all suffering from it. So, and the reason why I put that out there is because when we ask these questions about health and what drives our health, right, let's ask ourselves the really root question. Not the oh, woe's me question about the individual, or the individual story that kind of drives this notion or this narrative that we have about folks and fit things into that narrative, but really understand what it is that we're facing and what the communities are up against, particularly communities in the African American community, to understand that we're all disadvantaged by this conversation. So how the African American community goes the rest of Oakland, goes the rest of California, goes the rest of the nation.
This question is for the whole panel. When you watch news on television, you read the paper, listen to the radio, what's one thing that each of you feels media is getting wrong about the communities that you support?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I would say the positive stories. You know, obviously, you know, the whole "if it bleeds, it leads," and that notion is. There's so much good going on in the community. I mean, if you talk about juvenile justice, again, for instance, it's a pretty small portion of the youth population in the county that are involved in the juvenile justice system. And even among the black community, again, in Alameda County, we have 2,000 youth on probation. About half of them come from Oakland, and about another half, 50% of all youth on probation are black, although only 13% of the county is black. But of that, that's a very small population of young people in the black community that are engaged in the juvenile justice system, and so. But you know, obviously, you would get the sense that anywhere you go in East Oakland, you're going to be robbed, maimed, and killed. So it's the more positive stories, or even just balanced. You know, there's huge challenges with dropout rates and academic performance in schools, but there's those stories that, you know, there's the majority of the stories are successful that we don't hear. So I would say just the success stories.
I would actually agree with David. I think what strikes me is that there's this notion, I mean, we kind of perpetuate stereotypes. There's a notion that if you're poor, then there's something wrong, there's something bad. If you're in foster care, that you must be, you know, there must be something wrong with you. What I see is that the media, and I'm trying to pick my words carefully, all too often the media goes with what sells. And this is totally my opinion, what sells often is not reflective of the reality. And I would say if I could change anything, what I would also agree with David is that we should have more positive stories. There are a lot of great things that happen in poor communities. There's a lot of innovative, a lot of creative people who live in poor communities. How do we highlight that and not highlight, the person who just got shot down the street and the fact that, the youth who did it all had on black hoodies, t-shirts, and of course that somehow represents every African-American youth in East Oakland or West Oakland. So I think, the balance of the stories, being able to report on what's factual, but also looking at the positives, what is really going on at the grassroots level on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I would agree. I think that for our young people, they notice, that Oakland is constantly in the news for a lot of negative things, and that affects them. And I think it helps perpetuate this picture of Oakland being very dangerous, and it's something that sometimes our young people carry as a badge of honor. Like, people are afraid of me because I'm from Oakland. And then you look on the news, and the only time that we get national coverage is for very negative things that make you, sad to see that this is how we're being portrayed when there's so many amazing things going on. And I think that, homicide is the leading cause of death for young people ages 15 to 24 in East Oakland, so really the population that we work with. And so these young people all have names, they have stories, they have people that care about them. And so very rarely you'll see the stories every once in a while of really who these young people were, to give them a voice. But it's always like they're the exception. And so then all the other young people, it's just a blurb. This person was killed, they're unnamed. The follow-up story may give them a name. But I think that it helps to create this image that the young people that are killed, that they deserve it, that this is something that was supposed to happen, that, what they were involved in, it was going to happen. And then you see the conversations on there of people just not really understanding the full story and the context. And there was a great story that I shared in the Tribune earlier with everybody up here about really the trauma that folks go through and young people that they grow up around. And so I think that to be able to paint that picture of really what does it mean to grow up in Oakland for these young people, what are their lives like, what led to what was going on with them, is very important for other people to understand and to, I feel, really give young people in Oakland a chance to be able to support different programs and services and really make these neighborhoods a priority.
So I want to add, and then I think we have one more. Okay. So, for us, and we've been trying to support a good deal of this work, but one thing that we would really like to see is, and it be less the exception and be more the rule, is really kind of asking this question of what's the story behind the curve. Right. The stories, more often than not, kind of stay at convention or stay at what we think a narrative is or a frame is. And I think everyone spoke to it up here, but not really ask the next kind of question after that. Right. What is it that actually drives the story that I'm writing? And include that in the information that's reported out. And the reason why I say that is that far too often, because information is the lifeblood of democracy, right? And the media is the one who is the purveyor of that information, whether it be new or legacy media, that the narrative that's put out there becomes the thing that it is, right? Perception becomes reality. So the question is, how do you actually really challenge what perception is? And I think that is really asking yourself always, whether you do it through what Maynard does with the fault lines work or what Pointer does with its work, is really asking the next question: what is that story behind this curve? What is a root cause, right? What is the etiology of what I'm talking about, right, in my story? And really getting to that so we can actually get a richness, a flavor that connects up stories that are usually individually focused, but cast in this narrative about a broader community of interest, right? So there's this notion about what African American community is, but we always go to the one individual story to use that as proxy to tell this broader kind of narrative. But there's never a connection between the two because we don't click on that next question, right? So for us, if we saw that as a trend, and it happens, don't get me wrong, it happens, but it is notable by its exceptionalism. But if it happened more often than not, that would actually be a great thing.
Can you give an example of a story that you think does that, makes that connection between the individual and the community, that link that you're talking about, like what that looks like?
Well, the trauma story, that the series on trauma that just ran took individuals and spun out what has actually happened both in that neighborhood, that community, and that individual's life that all thread together.
Yeah,
Right.
let me just, absolutely. The Tribune, with the, and again, a good partnership with philanthropy and media to get more in-depth stories. And it's an interesting story of, if we have more resources in the paper that we can do more in-depth reporting. But, if you hear a story about the Washington Post, when I was in D.C., did a series of kitty car thieves. And it was a bunch of stories about how all these children were stealing cars and crashing, and they were, becoming worse. But, if you look behind that story, this young person, dad's not at home, mom works 2 jobs to, pay rent and keep food on the table, and all around his community is liquor stores, drugs, guns, poverty, blight. He goes to school, acts out of the trauma that he's experiencing. He gets suspended for 5 days so he can sit home all day for 5 days, but mom can't take off of work because she's living paycheck to paycheck, and so he has nothing to do while he's at home, and so he's walking around his community, steals a car because adolescence in the black community has really been criminalized, so that's the fun that you have to do. We're now arresting them and want to send them away. In the white community, they're calling it joyriding. And so it's that type of more in-depth reporting. What's behind, if all I hear is 14-year-old steals a car and runs into a store, crashes and runs into a store. What's all that behind that story that we could be addressing, not just how terrible this little 14-year-old is?